Okay, my talk is entitled Social Welfare in Singapore, Myth and History. In the first place, social welfare and Singapore, the two terms doesn't really mix. No, right? Yeah. Okay, there is a general perception that welfare, Singapore's social and economic policy is anti-welfare. There are a few things that support this perception. The absence of official poverty line, modest social protection, limited social assistance, apparently unreasonable income cut-offs for social assistance programs. Okay, all of which are furthermore buttressed by the rhetoric by the leading personalities of the country, the prime ministers. So let's start with the first one, Mr. Lee Kuan Yew. This is a quote taken from his memoirs. Just read it out. In a chapter called Fair, Not Welfare Society, when governments undertook primary responsibility for the basic duties of the head of a family, the drive in people weakened. Welfare undermined self-reliance. People did not have to work for their family's well-being. The handout became a way of life. The downward spiral was relentless as motivation and productivity went down. People lost the drive to achieve because they paid too much in taxes. They became dependent on the state for their basic needs. Very forceful and succeeding. His successors continued along that similar vein. Okay, Goh Chok Tong in an NDR speech in 2001, he spoke of avoiding a crutch mentality, which would lead to indolence, dependence, and abuse. He also warned in 2002, during a time when the government was actually expanding their social assistance programs, that expansion should not be an indication that Singapore was becoming, in its own words, a welfare state. Now, the third Prime Minister Prime Minister Lee Hsien Loong, he does not also deviate much from this approach. On the occasion of launching the Community Care Endowment Fund, or ComCare for short, it's a fund that actually provides support and funds for social assistance programs. Prime Minister Lee felt the need to warn that we must avoid a welfare mentality in Singapore. It would appear then that since the first Prime Minister, that Singapore's political leadership has interpreted terms like welfare state, very narrowly. Welfare does not lead to a fair society, it undermines self-reliance, and leads to a state of dependency. That is the basic assumption of their rhetoric. Such rhetoric, I would suggest, however, jars with certain realities. State interventions in society have been particularly paternalistic since the PAP took over, particularly in the area of housing, in providing mass and affordable apartments, at least in the early years, not now. But without going into the questions of adequacy, previous incarnations of the Ministry of Social and Family Development have been providing various social assistance and social services. In its official website, the Central Provident Fund is presented as a comprehensive social security savings plan, most probably based on how the CPF allows each individual, with some restrictions, to pay for their medical bills, to save for their retirement, and also to provide some sort of financial support for housing and the education of their children. There is also a recognition that government cannot or does not want to do it all alone in the area of social welfare. It wishes to work with the community at large, a wish that is represented by the existence of the National Council of Social Service, first established in 1992. Social work is more of a profession in Singapore, supported by institutions and training courses, training centers such as the NUS Department of Social Work, the Social Work Program at the SIM University, and more recently the Social Service Institute. All of these, I suggest, are tangible entities in what we can probably call a social welfare landscape in Singapore. A landscape which I feel has been shifting slightly very recently. For example, cash transfers from the government to the individual has become more constant and regular. I myself, as a low-income grad student, have benefited from workfare. I received at least 3 payouts because I stayed in employment for consecutive about 3, 6, 9 months. I was very happy to receive that amount. That's fair. And on another point, there is serious discussion, as most of us would, all of us would know, MediShield Life is going to come into being, which is a compulsory nationwide healthcare insurance scheme. And there's also been announced last year a mandated, or early this year, a mandated basic wage for the low-income professions. So MediShield Life is actually a kind of scheme that is based on the social insurance principle, while the basic wage, mandated basic wage is also a kind of minimum wage. It goes by any other name. But I'm not here to talk about contemporary social policy, not too directly at least. My purpose is to present very broadly the outlines of a social welfare history in Singapore. I suggest that negative connotations and very narrow definitions of terms like welfare and the welfare state have marginalized, hidden, and understated very substantial histories of how state and society in Singapore has responded to social needs over time. But to reach those histories, terms like welfare and the welfare state have to be situated in a context, in a situation where those terms were actually invoked, which is the immediate post-war years, the late 1940s, 1950s. So the definition you'll see on the slide now, yes, this is a definition of the welfare state as it was in the 1950s, or at least by one of the social historians, Asa Briggs. This describes the British welfare state, which was meant to provide equity and social justice no matter what social class we're from. So Lee Kuan Yew's words, or his chapter entitled A Fair, Not Welfare Society, I would suggest was in response to the fallout of the welfare state when it started going bankrupt or started being big in debt. That was in the 1980s and the 1990s. So those words, stated so authoritatively, but captured really in a timeless vacuum of a memoir, have the potential to skew our perceptions of present-day realities and our approaches to Singapore's past. Now, there are substantive histories that underpin Singapore's current social welfare landscape. The current Ministry of Social and Family Development can trace its roots to the Singapore Department of Social Welfare, which was first established in June 1946 by the colonial government. Professor N. Wee, a veteran social worker herself, and contemporary of the times, traces back even further to the Chinese Protectorate, which started in 1877. Now there is evidence to substantiate this connection. The first heads of the social welfare department were all former Chinese Protectorate men. And the social welfare department continued some of the functions of the Chinese Protectorate, such as protection of at-risk women, care for children, as well as general counseling. Now, MSF today is also a very interesting outcome of the restructuring of 2 ministries. It was formerly known as the Ministry of Community Development, Youth and Sports. Now, shorn of the Community Development, Youth and Sports portfolios, its functions right now is very similar to the Colonial Department of Social Welfare. It looks at public assistance, it takes care of programs and institutions addressing juvenile delinquency, It looks at matters of childcare, protection of at-risk women, at-risk children. So I would say that for the first time since the Colonial Social Welfare Department, Singapore has once again a government agency similarly dedicated solely to issues that can be collected under the heading social welfare. The CPF is another inheritance from the colonial period and was a product of discussions concerning the social security of workers. The return of British to Singapore coincided with the emergence of what came to be known as the welfare state in Britain and elsewhere in Europe. During the late 40s and 1950s, the British welfare state was identified by the National Health Service, legislation for national insurance, legislation for national assistance, all of which sought to provide the British worker and their families a sense of security during certain social contingencies: old age, sickness, injury, unemployment. Now, the people looking to lead and govern Singapore at that point in time were not unaware of such developments around the world. The first suggestion of a comprehensive social security scheme came actually from Lim Hock in 1948. He was then a nominated unofficial in the Legislative Council, nominated to represent the interests of workers. In August 1948, he suggested that all commercial firms should be compelled by law to provide either a Provident fund or a social insurance scheme for their employees. The following year, in 1949, he went further, pushing through a resolution in the Legislative Council that committed the government to form a committee to consider social security measures. Now, the colonial government at that point in time, via the Social Welfare Department, had also been considering the question of social security since 1947 and had formed a social security working party. But not much headway was made due to various reasons, such as staff shortages and a high turnover of their head of departments. So such instability did not help continuity. But as a result of such discussions, they needed data. They realized they needed data for social policy. So the Social Welfare Department conducted several surveys. One of the major ones was Goh Keng Swee's Urban Incomes and Housing, which was conducted at the end of 1953 and completed in early 1954 and published in 1956. The survey provided a host of data on the living conditions of the lower income groups, which included a minimum standard of living, which can also be roughly defined as a poverty line. Now, the history of social security in Singapore can be portrayed as either, depending on your position, either a tragic comedy or a comic tragedy. So let's start with the CPF. All of us have heard the story before. CPF started in 1955, but the bill was actually introduced by the Progressive Party in 1951. So almost immediately, the colonial government threw a spanner in the works. The governor formed a committee to look into retirement benefits, and the committee had to choose between pensions or Provident fund. The committee recommended pensions. Of course, they didn't follow up with that because I think the Progressive Party went on a media campaign and said $30 a month, a pension is too low at that point in time, and the Progressive Party got their way. Then the Comedy on the Charity comes in 1955. So, the bill was passed in 53, and preparations was made from 53 to begin operations in 55. And the Comedy on the Charity starts in 55 because the Progressive Party lost the elections. So the Labour Front government came in. The Labour Front government, this was kind of an unwanted baby for them. They commissioned two studies of the Singapore social security situation, and both committees recommended a social insurance scheme for the colony. This meant an insurance fund with contributions from employer and employee administered by the state. And after you meet certain requirements, or meet certain, some of the rules, you'll get benefits for old age, sickness, maternity, and at a later date, work injuries and unemployment. So discussions were going on from 55 to 59. They actually had a report which included a draft bill for a social security scheme, for a Ministry of Social Security, but guess what happened in 1959? Labour Front government lost the elections and we became the winner. So from 1959 onwards, all the social security plans will not happen. And by 1961, we know the history, other things took the PAP's attention. So in many ways, what's happening today, the discussions about healthcare, the discussions about CPF, and the very, very strong agitation for change to social policy, for reform to our social policy. So at least to this historian, it looks like a resumption of those discussions that was happening in the 1950s. So partnership, next point will be a partnership between government and community is another legacy of the colonial period. The NCSS had actually succeeded the Singapore Council of Social Service, which existed from 1958 to 1992. The SCSS in turn succeeded a Social Welfare Council which was in existence from 1946 to 1958. The council comprised of nominated or invited members who were mostly representatives of the major voluntary and religious groups at that point in time. So for example, the churches, the Salvation Army, as well as members from the upper strata of society. Now the Social Welfare Council, the interesting thing about this is the Social Welfare Council, not the Social Welfare Department, was actually the intention of British colonial social welfare policy. During the war, a series of policy directives has been drafted to prepare for the rehabilitation and reconstruction of their post-occupation territories. The Social Welfare Policy Directive did not indicate that a department should be set up, but rather a social welfare officer which will coordinate the efforts between society and government. The underlying assumption here is that the colonial government or the colonial office wanted to tap on the expertise of the local voluntary and social service groups. So they basically did not want to run it by themselves. But by 1946, Singapore and Malaya were the only Far Eastern territories that had a social welfare, a full-fledged social welfare department. Hong Kong did not have one until much later. So I would suggest there's a contributory factor to the presence of I suggest that this is because there was there existed an alternative option to colonial rule. Now, this is how the story of the public assistance scheme began. So when the war ended, the British returned to Malaya ahead of schedule. Plans were actually made to provide relief services while fighting was still ongoing. So all the relief services were temporary, to provide food, to provide temporary shelter. There are no plans at all to provide financial aid. But when they returned, elements of the MPAJA straight away presented the British military administration with very detailed plans on disbursing financial aid to registered applicants. So they wrote down, yeah, we registered 300,000 over people, we identified the sites where we're going to disperse, we have the resources. All they needed was the cash. So 1 week after that particular meeting between the elements of the MPAJA and the BMA, the British set up their own emergency relief committee. So, and they padded a committee with people they trusted. People from the Salvation Army, people from the Anglican side of things, even churches. The MPAJA groups were of course invited. They were actually formed the largest representatives in the committee. The welfare department in Singapore and Malaya, they were not really planned for. The Social Welfare Council was, but local circumstances fundamentally affected the implementation of colonial social welfare policy, which in turn affected how the council operated. It was chaired by the head of the Social Welfare Department, which made all the meetings like reporting and feedback sessions for the Social Welfare Department. The intention of the Social Welfare Policy Directive was actually to encourage local initiative, to initiate their own schemes to help the community at large. This could not happen until the Singapore Council of Social Service came about in 1948. So the final, well, not the final, sorry, but last but not least, the NUS Department of Social Work one of the major entities of a social welfare landscape in Singapore, has also its roots in the Social Studies Diploma Program, which was took in its first students in 1952. The establishment of a social welfare department, or even the operation of the social welfare policy, demanded trained staff with expertise and knowledge to carry out the social work. So in 1952, the Social Studies Diploma Program took in its first batch of students, which included S. Naden and Cha Chung Fook, former Permanent Secretary Ambassador, plus many other luminaries of the social work scene. The original teaching staff included Professor N. Wee, who later on became the head of the social work department. Now, in the creation of an academic program meant to produce graduates to staff a government department and other social services, there is not only an institutional history, but an intellectual one as well. The diploma program was not really a social work program, but anthropology, sociological program. The coursework or course structure was modeled on the social sciences approach courses in the London School of Economics. And the student was exposed not just to personal casework, but a whole variety, broad range of subjects, including history, law, and economics. So the research papers I'm using for my own dissertation, the research papers of the diploma students, they read like sociological, anthropological studies. And they give lots of information on particular social situations. Let's say a village in the Southern Islands, various occupations like a trishaw rider, the hawker, the night soil carrier, the Sansui woman. So there's a wealth of information in the 1950s diploma studies and research programs. So hence, the introduction and implementation of social welfare in Singapore, or at least the study of the subject, opens up possibilities for expanding the boundaries of Singapore history and historiography. And hopefully in doing so, help us to comprehend why and how certain decisions were taken. More so than if we remain fixated on certain rhetoric, which becomes truth or fact if it continues unchecked. Now, with reference to this panel's title, Silent Spaces of History, sometimes silence ensues because questions are not asked. Or in the case of social welfare, the rhetoric becomes so pervasive, or its assumptions that welfare undermines self-reliance and work ethic continues unquestioned. Now, in asking and investigating the question, like how social welfare was introduced and implemented in Singapore, in understanding how social welfare was perceived in that particular historical moment in time, Singapore history expands considerably. On one level, the story of how and why social welfare came to Singapore is part of a broader imperial, global, and social movement narrative. War, economic depression, and the fear of social movements had led to the early structures of the welfare state. So, for instance, the 1930s depression led to FDR's New Deal in the 1930s, which was a social security for the USA. Such factors also encouraged authoritarian figures like Germany's Bismarck to introduce the world's first welfare state structure, social insurance, unemployment insurance, health insurance. And it also encouraged free market disciples like the British Liberal Party in the earlier 20th century to intervene in society and to introduce social insurance in the 1910s. Now, fear of the British Empire falling apart during the heat of war, the Second World War, and wartime propaganda led to the introduction of the Colonial Development and Welfare Act in 1940. This was a fundamental shift in colonial policy because this committed the British people and a portion of their incomes to the development and the welfare of the empire. Despite predominant global and imperial origins, how social welfare was implemented in Singapore depended very much on local circumstances, as the story of how the public assistance scheme came about was shown. The British did and could not impose their will without negotiating and compromising with local society. this position gives us various approaches to understanding colonialism in Singapore and its legacies. So for instance, the introduction of social welfare marked a break between the pre-war laissez-faire approach to government and society and the post-war, more interventionistic, more paternalistic approach, which I think PJ has also alluded to, and the PAP has continued to some extent. It also encourages us, this realization also encourages us to question what we mean when we say colonial, especially during a time when the British were gradually withdrawing from direct involvement and locals were taking the center stage and getting more involved in making decisions. So to the extent that the provision of social welfare and other forms of social services in a very basic sense ties a community together, social welfare history could also help us move beyond the big man narratives and certain imperatives like economic vulnerability or political survival when we talk about nation building. We could focus, for instance, on the impact of the social work or the social service on the people who are directly involved, the social worker and the recipient. And perhaps those small connections and bonds formed between social worker and recipient gives meaning to the state and the nation. And from that approach, we actually have many social histories. Either stories of recipients requesting aid, or those who cannot get aid but are still vulnerable, the social welfare officer, the civil servant, the council member, the teaching staff and students of the diploma program, and the lady volunteers who assisted the department during the early years. So from such angles into the past, we can discern social living and working conditions of the people at that point in time. And we sometimes get a very different perspective from those people. So for instance, the superintendent of the girls' home, Maria Hertog stayed in, was less concerned about Maria Hertog than the rest of her kids because she had to find food and during curfew. Or the British head of department who either stupidly or bravely charged a crowd during the Chinese middle school unrest just to rescue the Union Jack. Or one of the pioneers of the People's Association who continued working during the 1961 People's Association strike. This is quite interesting because our interviewer asked him, so what do you think about politics? And like that, I still got to work. Half of the picket lines were his friends, people he knows for a very long time. So it gives a very, I don't know how to put it, but it gives a very real sense of someone maybe just trying to get along or move along with his work. So to sum up, all it needs sometimes to dispel myths is to question the assumptions of those myths. For me, it actually started, to be honest, for me personally, it started when I was working in the MCYS after I graduated. So if Singapore was anti-welfare or don't have any welfare, then what was I or my colleagues doing? So it started from there for me. Thank you for listening.